and this week's one is called Storm in a Teacup. So a little bit of reference there to the calm we've seen in the past week in the bond yields markets in general, as things have calmed down and we haven't had the meltdown that a few people were talking about. I did speak last week to the fact that I thought we needed to hold our nerve and things would get better pretty quickly, and indeed within a week they have done. The perverse thing about them getting better is what better means is that the UK is delivering poorer economic data than expected. But we need to get used to that if we want interest rates to go down. It's always a fine balance, and that is the macroeconomy for you. It is what it is. So every week I like to start with a quote, and this week's was, "It's just a storm in a teacup," someone says. The cup of suffering is not the same size for everyone. And that's from Paulo Coelho, the novelist and lyricist. Now, before I get started in earnest, I just want to report back on a fantastic property business workshop that we delivered this week in London about productivity, about time tracking, about strategic planning, and about bookkeeping and accountancy and financial accounting. I'd also like to thank everyone who attended who's a regular listener to the supplement. It was a fabulous day, and in the breaks between the information blasts, also a super opportunity to meet some real movers and shakers in the property investment and development space. Our next workshop's on the 1st of April, Tuesday, where the topic is due diligence, which will be an entire day on due diligence, back after popular demand. We did deliver a DD workshop in 2024, but we also tried to cover joint ventures and M&A on the same day. It was a fabulous day, but it was far too ambitious. We need a whole day on due diligence. Fresh content, new ideas, save the date. Now, I'm also collaborating with a couple of others to deliver a course on finding deals. Due to time constraints, we only run a maximum of 2 of these per year, and it might indeed be that we only deliver 1 for 2025. So alongside Daniel Kennedy and Nick Bond, I'll be there. This is Birmingham based, and we'll be talking through, no holds barred, the methods that we use on a daily and weekly basis to find a healthy stream of property deals, whether you're looking to buy them for yourself, become a property trader, or earn an extra income stream through sourcing for others. Now, we run these because, as per any of the training I get involved in, we're actually doing it with 90% plus of our time, and we're talking about it with 10% of our time. And that's the right ratio, in my view, to get real world and up-to-date information. It's great value, it's very intensive over the 3 days, and as always, it's packed with content. There's more details, if you're interested, at bit.ly/sourcing solved 2025. And there's a link in the show notes as well. So welcome to the supplement. We're now more than halfway through January, unbelievably. 1/24 of the year already gone, or more actually. And it's been quite a week, the best week for the yields for some time, so some reasons to be cheery. And I felt compelled earlier in the week to extol the virtues of Rachel Reeves. Yes, really, versus Liz Truss. Then the bond market settled down. This was, of course, a complete fluke, but perhaps suggests that I was on the right lines, and the market thought more like me than like Liz and her popcorn defenders, or whatever they call themselves this week. Yes, she's still a lettuce. That bonus video is on the Propenomix channel, or here on YouTube as a live video if you'd like to catch up with it. I'm not going to be repeating that content today anyway. But I am going to use the deep dive this week to get stuck into a couple of reports. One ONS one on low and high pay that I've had my eye on ever since it was published, and also the latest one from net migration on the ONS, which was produced at the back end of last year, because it's such a big factor in rental demand going forward, and indeed economic growth overall as it goes. So in the real time slot this week, Chris and the Property Market Stats Show are back. We get to ask that question one more time. What is currently happening in the UK property market? Now, firstly, it's a funny old week one, because it all depends on when the working year started. So these stats are representing the week commencing the 6th of January. And the fact it was the 6th rather than the 2nd or something like that has a distortionary impact. Don't worry, that is taken into account in the analysis, but I mention it because you always need to look at where the data starts and ends, and watch out for those anomalies when you're looking at any kind of data. So, listings are the first part of the equation. 27,420 listings in the week, the most in a week one in the past 8 years. And of course, some of those week ones started on the 7th of January, not the 6th. But it certainly looks like another busy year for listing stock. And my personal theory that the landlord community is providing a boost to what would be listed anyway is difficult to pass in real time from the rest of the figures. But we'll see what plays out, and eventually the figures will catch up to prove what I feel we already know. On reductions, 7.8% of stock was reduced in December, but we can't tell a lot from that. It always drops. That number's normally in the double digits, low double digits, but most are removed from the market instead and then relisted, or the vendors have given up. Then there's the Boxing Day phenomenon anomaly to deal with, which happens but once a year. 19,237 homes were sold subject to contract. Again, a start to the year looks fairly unrivaled, although 2021 did outperform this. That was a year where week one started on the 4th of January, but also a year where in the end there were 1.5 million or more sales agreed net, compared to an average between 1.1 and 1.2 million. A real good old-fashioned boom year, the likes of which we'll only see with significant anomalies, stimuli, or other changes in the market that are quite dramatic in the future. None of that on the cards for 2025, which isn't a bad thing, because booms are often followed by, no, not lettuces, but busts. Sale fall-throughs hit 1 in 3 in week one, but again that's typical because you have a glut of fall-throughs over Christmas and people simply changing their minds or splitting up before they get together properly, if you follow. No alarm bells from that one. As always, the stock on the market took a trimming as per the analysis I've already talked through, but we ended December with 605,000 houses on the UK market, the highest level stock being carried into a new year since Chris's figures began in 2017. The next highest was December 18, which was 572,646. So a typical year saw between 500 and 550,000 houses carried into the new year. Not huge, but we're sort of 10 to 20% above the norm of the pre-COVID era. On the other hand, the sales pipelines are a lot fuller. 441,342 that are sale agreed, compared to about 300,000 at this point, 2017 to 19. A very steady number at that point, 46 to 47% up. The big number, house prices on Chris's data, the magical pounds per square foot figure, which he leaves out mansion transactions, the bigger ticket stuff. We ended December at £339 a foot, which was down from £342 a foot in November. So Halifax might have been on the button with their adjustment last week of a little drop in December, but that metric is still 5.28% up on December 2023's £322 a square foot. These numbers hit the land reg 5 months later on average, and so you'd expect that to be the difference between May 24 and May 25. There's a 92% correlation between the pounds per square foot figure and what the data says at the land reg 5 months later. It's a big score for correlation. We've got to wait and see, of course, until the ONS gets there. That'll be about July. So there we go. I was also delighted by Chris graphing and reporting on average rents regionally, and I've repeated the numbers below, and I was so pleased I used it as the image for this week. So thanks to Chris. Illuminating, just look at the Southwest, and Bristol can only take so much of the blame. It's utterly eye-watering, so much so that I'm not sure these figures are correct, to be honest with you. But we do have to consider, has the average unit that's being rented changed dramatically in the Southwest? Is this because there are many more very nice holiday properties at the top end? Is Airbnb polluting the figures? I don't know. It's probably a whole supplement in itself. But I'm not going to read through all of the regions. They are there in the text version of the supplement if you want to seek that out on my LinkedIn, Adam Lawrence, or on the Partners in Property website. I'll just read a few select ones out that are areas of interest to me, particularly the East Midlands. 2024 average rent £1,065. Growth since 2016, 45.5%. So these sound like asking rents to me, because the average rent in the East Midlands is still quite a bit below that. It's still below £900, actually. Inner London, always interesting. 2024 average £3,141. Ouch. Growth since 2016, 26%. The Northwest averaging £1,141 now, and growth since 2016, 42.1%. The Northwest has done fantastically, but we're not at the end of that cycle yet, I wouldn't suggest by any means. Outer London, 2024 average 1,943, so more affordable, but just sticking under 2k. Growth since 2016, 22%. So bearing in mind where inflation's been in that time, you can see actually, certainly in terms of asking rents, not too far away. The East Mids has definitely grown significantly. The Northwest above inflation, but around about not too far away from where incomes are, actually. So although those sound like huge numbers because we've had big inflation, we've had incomes driving upwards, and it's not that rent is suddenly taking a vastly bigger share of incomes from households. Scotland rents up 46.8% since 2016. That's one worth looking at. Wales rents up 50.4% since 2016. So both places that have had more anti-landlord policies, generally speaking, than the rest of England, the rest of the UK. Is that a fluke? Probably not, to be honest with you. It's Chris's outlier figure now. The Southwest 78.4% up on rents, but he posts an average of 1629, which I think may well be a typo. It may well be 1269 or something like that. Don't know if Chris will watch this or not, but I'll send him a message anyway, just asking him to double check that one. And then the West Midlands, where I'm based, growth since 2016, 39.2%. Average asking rent now 1125. So Chris, we did miss you. It is good to have you back after a well-deserved break, but now it's time for the macro. So this week I call Juice Week because we've got inflation, we've got growth, we've got the ONS house prices and rents report, and then the fourth slot only belongs to the gilts and the swaps. And it's a week to linger on some good news there, so let's savour it. So this is big, let's get on with it. Inflation. Approaching 4 years since I've spoken of nothing more really than inflation. People still don't understand it, and the media still very rarely take it into account. Then we've got now what's an abject lie of a 2% target, the puffery that needs to be kept up to keep up appearances. Bond investors aren't stupid though, they've pretty much worked it out for themselves. But for those of us who want a number in the background to work to, and look, inflation targeting has been very successful since the early 90s and was imported from other parts of the world. It's still deemed to be, as we speak today, the best central bank target mechanism in the Western developed world. But that target's 3%, it's not 2%, or it should be 3%. So wait for these April price rises if they're not already filtering through. There's plenty of stuff that's going to go up far more than 3%. Any businesses, particularly staff heavy, are facing costs of 10.75% or more for employing a minimum wage member of staff. Then there's business rates increases as well, which are up 67% in some cases. No, I haven't missed a decimal point there. Cheers, Rachel. However, this is December's inflation figure, and we printed 2.5% on CPI. That was 0.1% below the expectation of 2.6%, and that almost always means a cut in the bond yields. It wasn't expected, and it was surprising on the downside. Happy day. The ONS prefer to lead their report with CPIH. That's their metric, including housing, and it never makes the media. But that printed 3.5%. And OOH, the metric I've really got my eye on, hit 8% for the first time ever. That's the owner-occupiers housing costs component. July 24 was 7%, Feb 24 was 6%, September 23 was 5%. So we had significant changes, right? 5, 6, 7, 8 in the course of less than 18 months. This metric lived under the CPI-CPIH graph until October 2023, and then it crossed over, and it's not showing a lot of signs of decelerating just yet. Now, this is defined by the ONS as OOH costs are the costs of housing services associated with owning, maintaining and living in one's own home. Now, since 2/3 of the population own their own home and rents are growing in the 9% plus region, this seems a pretty fair proxy for housing inflation, if you like. Not the price of housing, but the cost of living in one. This has a draining effect on the remaining resources to actually consume both staple goods like food and luxury goods, or anything discretionary really, anything you don't need to survive. And it affects the amount of consumption any economy can do, having a stifling effect on the growth of consumer spending, alongside many other implications. But any higher, and we'll be renaming OOH, OUCH. Ouch. CPI, CPIH downward contributions for December were from hotels and restaurants. I'm lucky enough to be out for a few nights in a month in restaurants and similar, and saw quieter population centres and quieter individual businesses than I would have expected for December, that's for sure. Transport made the biggest upward contribution. Core CPIH was up 4.2% annually. CPIH goods up 0.7% for the year. CPIH services up 5.4% for the year. Core CPI was 3.2%. The expectation was 3.4%. CPI services was down to 4.4, which, although still anything above 4% makes me feel fairly uncomfortable, it's the best print in that department for many a long month, since March 2022, unbelievably. So that really is very positive, especially with the amount that wages are being driven up at the lower end come April, and budget rises kicking in minimum wage and employers' national insurance contributions. So overall, we've got to see it as a positive inflation report. What's amusing to me, anyway, is that the media and the markets were overall delighted, even though we're still 0.5%, or 25% if you put it relatively, over the inflation target. Our actual target, however, as measured by the Bank of England, is 1.5 to 2.5% by the end of the forecast period. The next forecast is in February, so that will be by February 2028. The last two forecasts have been for inflation to be at 1.5 and 1.8 at the end of those respective forecast periods. Nonsense in my opinion, but not dramatically out, and it really doesn't matter what I think at all anyway. What matters here is what the Bank of England say and what their PhDs and their models say, because that's the number we live and die from. Now, this inflation report cemented reports of a February base rate cut, which we've all been expecting, and it was called 100% certainty in one article that I shared this week on my LinkedIn. There's no such thing, of course, but in terms of predictions, it will be a cut, and the votes will likely be 6-3 in favour of the cut. We know where the hawks and the doves are. If the vote's 7-2, 8-1, or even 9-0, that will really force the yield curves down. 6-3 won't move the needle much, although the bond yields will blow off the steam that was gathered by speculators that something was going to go wrong. Reeves is going to resign, the Bank of England are going to intervene, etc, etc. This is what I discussed in my live earlier this week. We never got close to that moment. The trust scenario was just too raw and too fresh in traders' minds, and they got carried away. But that's markets for you. There was also a drastically oversubscribed bond sale, which massively helped boost confidence. There were also some linkers sold this week, their inflation-linked 20-year gilts, at a very healthy 2.126% yield, and that's above inflation, remember. A magnificent investment for high nets who are seeking inflation insurance over the next 20 years, which is a very sensible thing to have. Don't worry, the best inflation insurance is residential property, folks, sensibly geared, and commercial isn't miles behind. So, enough inflation until the next time. Growth, right? If I was a vandal, I'd be graffitiing that on local Labour Party assets for the next 4 years. Talk and then deliver. And there's still confidence on the left that they will. Impossible to see from a private sector standpoint, but I've made the point before that the private sector is not the only fruit. It is the engine of the economy, but the further on the left you are, the more you believe the government can be effective, or perhaps more accurately, the more of an authoritarian you are. The more you're on the libertarian and often the right, the more useless and wasteful you think they are. The truth, as so often, is between those poles, and the front men and women mean far, far less than we think they do. Then again, get one bad lettuce in the barrel and the international bond markets soon teach everyone a lesson. Okay, enough salad for this week. 0.1% up in November for GDP. October's still down 0.1, so that's 0.0 on the Q4 thus far. Not exactly what we were promised. Services lumbered on to do their bit to drive the economy just about sideways after inflation has been taken into account. The rolling 3 months to November also shows 0.0. Services are sideways over that period as well. Production and construction balanced each other out. Production down 0.4, manufacturing struggles. We knew this because of the PMIs. This would probably be worse in December's figures when they come out because the December PMIs were very negative. Construction was up 0.4. Now, construction PMIs had their wings clipped a little bit in December, so you would think that net contribution could be lower next month, but month to month it depends what falls into November or December or January. We can't tell too much from month to month, as I always say. I just like to keep abreast of it. So, some little snippets from the next level down. The greatest contributor over the last quarter for services was human health and social work activities. Now, you'd expect this from Labour. This is, apolitically, economically, a positive when you have massive waiting lists and huge knock-on issues from under-provision, which ends up costing more money when it comes to social work. This is, in real time, an example of what I'm saying when I'm saying government spending increasing can drive GDP forwards. So don't lose all hope just because the private sector have been a bit shafted. On their own, they contributed plus 0.11% to GDP. That's £3 billion. It's not pocket change for a quarter. But what suffered most? Information and communication and admin and support service activities, which combined dropped by about the same number, hence why services haven't grown in 3 months. A lot of the rest were pretty flat. The only positives on the production and manufacturing side over the 3 months were in computer, electronic and optical products, and in rubber and plastics, and then a little bit less so in textiles. Everything else took a bath, and some a big bath. Construction, we know the story from the PMIs. Output is doing okay, but not because of house building. New work was up on the quarter. And the prime component of what grew was new private industrial work. Repair and maintenance was up because of public contribution to repair and maintenance, up 2.9, side by side with private repair and maintenance, which was down 1.3. That, you would think, takes out much weather-related activity, and I would theorise, but to an extent I'm fitting my own narrative here, that less repair and maintenance is because asset owners are looking to sell or sell soon. And the first thing that gets cut, whether it's deliberate or not, is the maintenance. New work is still 5.4% below 2022 levels. GDP revisions throughout the year are massive and downwards. Minus 0.3% on GDP, minus 0.4% on services. That's a huge difference from the published figures, which is miserable. Production more down than up. Construction nets out at the original figures we've been talking through. So with that, after one budget and one serious revision, 1% growth for the year will end up being very close. Although December will matter because it was a bad month in 2023. So maybe we'll get more like 1.2% ending up being the number. Oh, the abandon with which I said we would end 2024 between 1.5% and 2% before that snap election was called, because we were doing so well. We did 1.2 in the first half of the year. But let's make sure we keep up the accountability and critique me when I've got it wrong as well, because I love to do it to the big forecasting houses, as you might know. Onwards then, the ONS rents and house prices. A reminder, this report is a mixture because it talks about December rents but November house prices. So the tenant bonus to start with, rents were only up 9% year on year, down from 9.1 in November's rent numbers. Ouch. Unsustainable, of course, and creeping down, but only slowly. The strong correlations are with Zoopla or similar numbers on new rents, lagging by between 1 and 3 years. New rents are very much sustainable on increase at the moment, nationally anyway. In some regions they're up plenty, but that means existing rents are up more than 9% year on year. Why? Well, the ONS sample, the data loft data, has around 550,000 units in it. Those are some existing and around 20 to 25% of the new tenancies each year. Let's say 25%. If 25% of the sample is up 4% and the sample's up 9% in total, then that 25% contributes 25% of 4%, which is 1%. That means the other 75% contributes the other 8% to get 1 to 9, right? If 75% is 8%, then if it was just looking at continuing tenancies, not new ones, that number instead would be 10.67%. And that's a much better measure of the pain to existing tenants over the past 12 months when it comes to rent increases. Double digit. England's up by 9.2, Wales 8.5 and Scotland 6.9. No doubt some nutters will try and claim that's because the rent cap is working, but look at the figures over the past 3 years since it's implemented and try and claim that one. The ONS still has London rents up the most, 11.5%, and Yorkshire and the Humber only up 5.4. House prices are up 3.3 to November. They declared 3% the month before, but July's sold subject to contract figure was pretty good, so I'm still expecting a pretty good bump in this number when we get the 2024 official figures when the report comes out next month. Then it gets revised, sometimes over a period of a year or even more, just like normal ONS figures, as more data drops in. But the ONS has the average house price in England as £306,000, £219,000 in Wales and £195,000 in Scotland. Scotland has a far bigger percentage of flats, however, and less stigma around them, and no leasehold, well, nearly none anyway, but is wealthier than Wales generally, so that tells you about an interesting differential between the two devolved nations there. The drastic winners on house price inflation locally? The north. The northeast just edging out the northwest for a change, and Yorkshire hot on the heels, but all comfortably in the high 5% for the year. London fell 0.1 over the 12 months according to the ONS. On the rents, the northwest pulls off the double silver, up 9.6, so yields are improving as prices still race forward. London is that clear winner though. The northeast is not far behind with rents up 8.9. The south lags behind apart from Yorkshire as the outlier. The Midlands are appropriately right in the middle of the table. West Midlands up 8.7, East Midlands up 8.4. Still very significant. It's tight at the top of that regional table. The East Mid still looks inherently affordable at $8.56 a month on average, according to the ONS, whereas the $8.82 in the northwest also means we shouldn't be too near any macro affordability ceilings in that area just yet. Still time and room for rents to run. So the difference between the stock, that's the ONS or the data loft data, and then the flow measures, the new lets, is important. The last month with enough data was November for rents, up 9.1 on the stock measure, and up 4.1 according to Rightmove and Zoopla, and 2.2 according to HomeLet. Now in theory the real stock measure is actually ignoring all of the new lets, which the ONS doesn't do, but I've already been through the maths behind that. But I would suggest you've probably got 4% rent rises at base level for 3+ years to come, to be honest. Remember my prediction for the 2025 year, 7% rent rises on this metric, that's the PIPR ONS metric for existing tenancies, and the 550,000 strong sample from Dataloft. But for portfolio holders, I would argue this is the critical metric. New lets are good, but they're mostly good as an early warning system and forecasting tool. So, no sad readers there, no sad listeners, I can't imagine, although as I say, it's unsustainable. But here's a throwaway comment, or a little bit more than that. But here's how I think the rest of the Parliament is going to go. The Renters' Rights Bill will be rushed through, missing the point around rocketing rents, but largely against rent control, because it very recently really hasn't worked close to home, Scotland. Wales rejected it, controlled by Labour, still, just about. Not coming in this Renters' Rights Bill. Rent rises the next 3 years, 7%, 5.5%, 4.5%, something like that. Maybe worse, as in higher, worse for tenants, primarily thanks to Renters' Rights Bill inspired disposals. Depends what actually gets enforced and how much money there is for the ambulance chasers. The claims management companies, providing a crucial service for the public. My bad. Wages not keeping up, rents then officially up well above inflation since 2015, and definitely above since 2020. And probably keeping pace with income rises. But income pays tax, remember. Rents are taking a bigger share of the household pie. Political baying for rent controls, which will then scare more landlords out of the market, creating more of a problem, and then the next election is round the corner. Nothing will be sorted on evictions because they'll still happen for the same reasons they've always happened. One day someone will do some historical analysis and link it to the massive interest rate rises all of a sudden. Section 24 effectively kicking in within an 18-month time window rather than 4 years as George Osborne wanted and planned. Then you've got the increased cost of delivery, compliance, more effort, and an environment where you can, at the end of the day, today, sit still and get 4%-ish very safely in the bank or some bonds, rather than 1%, which you'd have been lucky to get 10 years ago. Eviction has normalised, but because the Section 24 interest rate normalisation wave has gone, Labour claims success, but tenants are bleeding at the rent increases that are by then relentless. Political success will be claimed that's actually a failure. As I say, rent controls are then mooted as a policy to desperately fight the populists that will be right at the front of the polls. And let's face it, they already are. So, those are just my thoughts, but please remember them. Let's see how I get on over the next few years. On to the section that inspired this week's title, the aforementioned storm in a teacup. I was incensed this week and over last weekend when I saw the aforementioned Mary Elizabeth Truss, former MP, attempting to come back with a new argument as to why she really wasn't a complete failure as a Prime Minister, and with her economic leadership of, oh, stop making a fuss about these little details, we're cutting taxes and we're not allowing these annoying quangos to get in the way. She's propagated various myths about the Bank of England over the years and how they conspired against her by selling bonds. Something you know about if you look and read, because they give the markets a huge amount of notice and detail on these things, because they're correctly and properly run from a governance perspective. No, this is not the same as me saying that the governor is great, but still, it could be a lot worse. So this door was opened by the gilt markets, yields were rising, some was because of Trump speculation and the inflationary policies that the Donald has been talking about. The External Revenue Service was this week's chat, if you missed it. Posturing at a global level, it really is quite clever negotiation. I'm fascinated to see what's going to happen, and I'm not worried at all. I think that's the best way to take it. I did really like a quote I heard this week. The media don't take him at all seriously, but they do take him completely literally. This is completely the wrong way round, and we need to take him seriously, but not literally. Trump Trash Talk, or Triple T if you prefer, needs to be an acronym you get your head around. Copyright Propenomix, January 2025. So shut that door, throw away the key. The lettuce was a lettuce, and the newfangled weaselly misrepresentations of the fact by the popular Conservatives, which is one of the worst names ever. They are far less popular than almost any other movement at this time. I prefer popcorns myself, and it needs to be discarded. They need to be fact-checked. The very best you can say, just as I said at the time and have said many times since, is that Truss and Kwarteng's policies had merit, but their timing was completely off, and their execution was like a badly planned 6-year-old's birthday party. And that's the best you can say. So, rant over. The gilts then. The markets calmed down when it became clear the UK was nowhere near mobilising the Bank of England, and Rachel and her cronies nodded to the city that all was fine, calm down, keep calm and carry on. And it worked. When there's a squeeze or a sell-off like that, the dam can only hold so far. 5-year gilts at 5.4%. 5.473 was the highest close, and 5.5 was breached. It offered just too much exceptional value. Sorry, that was 30-year gilts, not 5-year gilts. 5.211 is still too high. A gift for those who want gilt money, in my view. So how did we go on our staple 5-year? We opened the week at a bonkers 4.588, well above my acceptable range, which at this time I think needs about 1/8% upward shift just to fully absorb the effect of this budget. So my now range for the year is 3.875 to 4.375 on the 5-year gilts. That's the predicted normalised range. If we're going to get a lot of normal, who knows if we are. The squeezers held on until Wednesday's inflation numbers, and then they got out of the trades. The growth numbers missed targets, and there were those revisions down I've already talked about, and we ended the week at 4.389% yield. A 20 basis point adjustment. Very nice indeed. Thank you very much. More of the same, please. But in fact, no, less volatility, please. I love 0.03% down once a week, every week for a year. But as Aerosmith and Steven Tyler would say, dream on. The swaps, well, Thursday's 5-year gilt close at 4.41 on the yields showed the 5-year swap close at 4.054. Now that's only 4 basis points above 1 month earlier and 31 basis points above 12 months earlier. Significant convergence, even though the path really is nowhere near as smooth as those three figures make out. So that would keep us at 6.05 cost of debt, and the concerns over 6.25% plus are abated somewhat. There's order in the markets. So for those who don't know, I had a couple of percent on to represent the margin between the swap rate and what I'm expecting limited company buy-to-let mortgages to be priced at. And there's still a fair bit of 5.99 out there, which doesn't look particularly wrong, but it doesn't look unfair by any means if you're not paying a fee, which is there and is available. That puts yield, in my opinion, investment grade yield at about 8.5%. So remember this perversity. Bad economic news below consensus, rates go down. Next week we've got unemployment figures. We're expecting 4.4. That's the broader economic consensus. but the data's just not trustworthy at the moment, so really anything could happen. Average earnings, let's see there, the consensus is a big increase. So anything less will again bring down inflation expectations and thus rate expectations. Then we've got the PMIs, which will be really interesting and could go anywhere. It could be quite a volatile one. My gut says unemployment will come up 0.5% or more this year and earnings calm relatively quickly. April's increases always make a difference, of course, so that calm might have to come in May and beyond. PMIs, I expect, will be above 50 on the composite and will be sort of 51 to 52 in services, just keeping our head above water again, but we'll see next week. So that's macro to the max this week. Now it's time for the deep dive, and it is deep, folks. Low and high pay from an ONS report last year, then going into ONS migration, which is related to an extent and certainly has been in recent years with policies that have allowed migrants to be paid lower wages. Those policies are over, by the way, if you're wondering. The first report comes from a survey from the ONS known as the ASHE, the Annual Survey of Hours and Earnings. Now, the first point of order that the ONS draw out in this report is quite an eyebrow raiser, and one that made none of the headlines I remember seeing at the time. And bear in mind, I read between 50 and 100 targeted or specific articles every day. I'm a very fast reader, and I've trained my Google News algorithm on my phone to show me deliberately stories I might be interested in. Now, you'll see why, because these positive bits of news never make the press. It also may well not feel appropriate, of course, on the back of a cost of living crisis, but either way, here we go. The proportion of low-paid employee jobs fell to 3.4% in April 2024 from 9.8% in April 2023. That's the lowest since the series began in 1997, while the proportion of high-paid employee jobs fell 0.7 percentage points on the year to 22.7 in April 24. Both of those declines are record lows. So pause there for a minute. Let's start at the low end. What would we theorise? Well, we know that minimum wage went up 9.8 in April 24. I certainly know, because I remember that figure tattooed on my brain. We know that people close to minimum wage either kept their 50p, £1.50, £2 enhancement, most likely. So they got a slightly smaller percentage increase because the fixed top-up is a lower percentage of a higher wage than it is of the original lower wage, but still got a healthy increase. Then as we go up the scale, the rises would have got smaller and the money has to come from somewhere. Here it looks like it came from the higher paid jobs. So, as economists love to say, all else being equal, the higher paid got lower pay rises to pay for the lower paid employees getting higher pay rises. But remember, this is all in percentage terms, not necessarily in pound notes. And that is indeed what played out when you look at those percentage increases for higher earners, much more like 4 to 5%. However, a record low paid proportion, and really low, almost 2/3 lower than the year before. Shouldn't we be shouting that from the rooftops? It also sounds a bit more communist than one might expect from, by that point, 14 years of Tory rule, but let's leave the politics to one side as much as we can. And don't worry, we'll get to the definition of low paid and high paid soon enough. Next bullet point along the same lines, average hourly pay, excluding overtime in April 2024, has increased for all percentiles year on year, but the increase has been larger in the lower deciles. Exactly what we'd expect following on from that last point. Next up, if you have a problem with this, then I prescribe a full dose of Animal Farm by George Orwell, which is amazing, if you haven't read it, by the way. The lowest earning employees tend to be younger, aged between 16 and 21, and in elementary occupations, including bar staff, cleaners, among others, or the hospitality industry. No further commentary, Your Honour. Now next up, perhaps there might be a tiny surprise here, but not much. I already knew this stat, but I suppose there wouldn't be a major surprise if instead it was in the 50 to 59 category. But of course the retirement age for the private pension at 55 still has a major effect in that age category, of course. The highest earning employees are concentrated in the managerial and professional occupations, aged between 40 and 49 years, or work in the information and communication and finance and insurance service industries. So we've got a plan. Be old, but not too old. Don't be a barman, work in accounts, or work in IT. Now the first one of those isn't really recommended in real life, of course, because one thing that none of us ever get back is our time. Then there's a last one, which is another eyebrow raiser. The number of employee jobs paid below the minimum wage and the national living wage is estimated to be 371,000, or 1.3% of the total, although this is not a measure of non-compliance. And you'll see why in a minute. So definitions. Low paid jobs are defined as those paid below 2/3 of the median hourly earnings. And high paid jobs are defined as those paid more than 1.5 times the median hourly earnings. And this is the OECD definition of low and high pay. In April 24, low paid jobs were those paid below £11.39 an hour, and high paid jobs were those paid more than £25.63 an hour. Look, it's a definition. We don't really get to take a position. We're not the OECD. However, I bet diamonds that when this report comes out for 2025 after the next minimum wage increase, we might start to see a new definition. Not for 2025 probably, but within a year or two. When succeeding and not shouting about it, move the goalposts, basically. You'll know this, or most of it, but it's a good standard ONS level statement that comes next. The steep decrease in 2024 can be partly explained by recent increases in the national minimum wage and national living wage, and the addition of those aged 21 and 22 to the national living wage rates. In 2024, April, the national living wage for those 21 and over was £11.44 an hour, which is 5 pence more than the maximum pay that defines low paid jobs. So now everyone on minimum wage is above the official low pay threshold number. So that won't then change anything on the back of that by pushing the minimum wage up even further, right? Although it will keep them closer to the median, which will guarantee that it doesn't slip back from the 3.4%. Now, don't forget, they added the 21 and 22-year-olds. A couple of years ago, they added the 23 and 24-year-olds because it used to be that minimum wage was for everyone 25 and over. Don't have a particular position on that at all, but it will change. You have to look at the fact that there's huge unemployment in under 25s, because if you're paying two people the same, you may well go for the one with more experience. It's going to be quite a natural and simple thing, folks, and we'll see how that plays out this year. So the Low Paid Commission the Low Pay Commission who set the national living wage, or suggested it anyway, have done exactly what they were asked to do. They've taken everyone out of low pay with the way they've pushed the minimum wage. In 1997, 25.2% of jobs were high paid, but 21.8% were low paid. So anyone in their right mind would accept a trade-off of 2.5% at the top end for a drop of 18.4 at the bottom end. But now we've had that, where do we go from here? So the minimum wage is below the low pay threshold. This can only leave people under 21 legally, and no minimum wage rise in the future will change this percentage, although expect the 18 to 21s to join the minimum wage at some point. The minimum wage can no longer do anything to change these figures, which is why the measuring stick will be changed, I reckon. That's just how it works. Here's some more interesting snippets. There was a large concentration of jobs paid within 20 pence of the national living wage in both April 24 and April 23, which was £11.44 for those aged 21 and over, and £10.42 for those aged 23 and over in April 23. This corresponds to the highest peak observed at April 24 at around £11.61. The second highest peak in April is between £11.81 to £12.19, around £12 an hour. So this can probably be attributed to employers choosing to pay employees £12 an hour instead of the national minimum wage, to either round up the figure or to pay the living wage as defined by the Living Wage Foundation. And that was £12 in April 24 for employees outside London and £13.15 for employees in London. There's also a smaller peak forming at the £12.50 and £13 an hour mark in the 2024 distribution. Full-time is defined as employees working more than 30 paid hours per week, or 25 or more for the teaching professions. Now that's interesting, because I'm pretty sure it doesn't work like that on universal credit or in any full-time job I've ever seen for that matter, but I'll leave you with the final two paragraphs with one comment at the end from me. The highest proportion of low-paid jobs in April 22 was observed in elementary occupations and the hospitality industry. So that's 13% and 17% accordingly. So 30% of low-paid jobs are concentrated in bar staff, cleaners, etc. and hospitality. Right, delivery drivers are also considered as an elementary occupation. The employees more likely to be in low-paid jobs were the young. 36.1% of employees 16 to 21 were in low pay, and women. 3.9% of women were in low-paid jobs compared to 2.8% of men. Amongst the regions and countries, the highest proportion of employees working in low-paid jobs was in Northern Ireland, 4.7%. The proportions of employees who were high paid were largest for managerial and professional occupations, 50.1% and 46% respectively. Those working in information and communication industry or the finance and insurance industry, 45% and 50.8% respectively. Workers aged between 45 and 49, 31.5% of them are high paid. Or those working in London, 39.9%. Similarly, men were more likely to be high paid than women, 27.1% compared to 18.3%. And full-time employees were more likely to be high paid than part-time employees, 26.6 compared to 12.1. Now, the type of job, I don't think anyone's got too much to say about that. The age part, again, learning. I mean, there's an apprentice rate for a reason, right? Women versus men, there really needs more context here. The broader academic literature shows time and again that men tend to work longer hours in more dangerous jobs and have longer commutes to work. Now, not all are true in every case, of course, but there's also some overlap. This isn't taken into account when simply comparing men and women. How much more likely are women to work part-time for some of their career? How about comparing those with children to those without children? Now, that might provide an interesting stat on the true gender pay gap rather than just lumping everything together. It just fuels an argument about it from the data that we can't really tell is even there. Now, the last part is again unsurprising, but the magnitude might surprise quite a few. It's quite difficult to be part-time and paid over 25 quid an hour. It's not surprising, but I don't know that I would have guessed the difference anywhere near accurately. So to remind you, 12.1% part-time, 26.6% full-time are in a high-paid job. So you're talking about the difference between 1 in 8 and more than 1 in 4. That is the magnitude of full-time work versus part-time work. So what's the headline really should be? Low pay is over for the over 21s as defined. Done. By the Tories before Labour was elected. Who knew? I certainly didn't. Now, if that hasn't stirred the pot enough, here comes a report on migration. To be clear, it's not my intention, but whenever discussing sensitive subjects, I'm aware of the ease with which they could offend. Although I'm exercising my right to offend without meaning to, if that makes sense. If we tiptoe through life, we have no meaningful discussions. Now, this is juicy in volume. Trips off the tongue in terms of the title too. Long-term international migration provisional. Year ending June 2024. Now, unlike the low and high pay report, this one did get a lot of coverage because it's guaranteed clicks, you see. Long-term, like no other proper economic definition, in this one refers to people entering or leaving the UK for a period of at least 12 months. And that's a United Nations definition in this example. I mean, I'd call that medium term personally and stick to 5 or more years for long term, but then look, I'm a pedant. So the first paragraph is very rarely critiqued by those who are on the against side in an immigration debate. It seems, as much ONS reportage does, to be largely fair. Since 2021, long-term international migration to the UK has been at unprecedented levels. This has been driven by a variety of factors, including the war in Ukraine and the effects of the post-Brexit immigration system. Pent-up demand for study-related immigration because of travel restrictions during the coronavirus pandemic also had an impact. Now, the next part was widely criticised, and rightly so, having said what I said earlier. Our provisional estimates show a 20% reduction between our updated estimate for year ending June 2023, 906,000, and our latest estimate for year ending June 2024, 728,000. So let me give you the likely fashioned entirely by me ONS perspective. Figures at the ONS change all the time. They use the word latest estimate deliberately. This figure will continue to change for up to 3 years after the event. However, show that to someone not familiar with the ONS or someone who distrusts the ONS because they distrust anything to do with the government following the events of the pandemic, and they will scream conspiracy at the top of their lungs because this new figure for June 2023, 906,000, was a significant increase on the previous estimate. The previous estimate, published 6 months before, was 740,000. Now, it would be valid to argue that a move in an estimate from 740 to 906 was in itself worth a bullet point in 6 months more of data. Finding 166,000 people net, that could be more coming in, fewer going out than expected, or a cross of the two, of course, sounds like a pretty big deal. It's an extra 22.5% on top of that figure. It's definitely significant. There were 181,000 extra net people found for the year ending December 23. Some of those are the same people as the extra 166,000 people, of course, but some are different. The time periods overlap by 6 months, but have got 6 months either side on each side. So this 22.5% increase in the figure to June 23, for example, is less than the magnitude of the drop of 20% in the new figure. Will that be subject to similar revisions upward? Or it looks like it anyway. A 22.5% increase is actually lower than a 20% decrease, because that's how percentages work. But then we get another fairly dispassionate paragraph which looks fair. This fall is driven by a decline in long-term immigration, mainly because of declining numbers of dependents arriving on study visas. And most recent data points also show decreases in the number of people arriving for work-related reasons. This is consistent with visa data published by the Home Office and in part reflects policy changes from earlier this year. It's also driven by a rise in long-term emigration, most notably for those who came to the UK on study-related visas. This is likely a consequence of the large number of students who came to the UK post-pandemic now reaching the end of their courses. Now the rest of the meat of this report is significant. I've had to opt from here to summarise and use bullets because I know we've already been here a long time this week and I realise some might not be as interested in this topic as I am. I'm fascinated from a business perspective because this is the future clientele of the private landlord taking shape. Not UK or even EU born people, but migrants from outside the EU. The quantum of that, of the 1.2 million people who came to live in the UK in June 2024 year end, around 86%, around 1 million, were non-EU nationals. 10% were EU nationals. Now it's EU plus they use, so that includes Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein and Switzerland. And then 58,000 were British nationals, 5%. And then if we focus on the 1 million EU nationals, 82% of them, 845,000, were of working age, 16 to 64, and 179,000 were children. That's 82% of working age, 17% of children, and it doesn't quite add up because there's rounding, as there often is. That only adds up to 99% for those paying attention. 80,000 under 16s came as study dependents, which is down from 115,000 in the year end June 2023. 184,000 came as work main applicants. 233,000 came as work dependents, so 1.27 dependents for every one worker. 84,000 claimed asylum. Now that includes what they call irregular entrants, that's like small boats, and then regular entrants who came through a more defined regular asylum route. So of the 479,000 people who left the UK in year ending June 24, around 44% were from the EU plus, 39% were non-EU plus, and then 16% were British nationals. So 58,000 British nationals in and 79,000 British nationals out. So this is the other side of the fence. 21,000 net British nationals leaving the UK. Now the recent reports you might have seen this week, again I shared on my LinkedIn, a millionaire leaving every 45 minutes. We'll have to keep an eye on this balance over the coming years and see what actually plays out. 60% of the non-EU plus nationals who left for study reasons because their courses were complete. In year end June 2024, 417,000 non-EU plus nationals came to live in the UK for work-related reasons, closely followed by study-related immigration, 375,000 people. Other reasons non-EU nationals came to the UK: asylum, 84,000, family reasons, 76,000, and humanitarian reasons, 67,000. Now, there's an unknown here that I've never seen it discussed before. 417,000 into the UK for work, but we know now how that breaks back. 184,000 workers, 233,000 work dependents. What we don't know is how many of those work dependents go on to get a job, of course. And we need to find out. 375,000 to study. I mean, quite incredible, really, quite incredible. We conclude asylum actually is a small percentage. It's also relatively small in number compared to many European countries. And as a throwaway aside, there were 50% more arrivals in the Canary Islands in 2024 via irregular routes or small boats than there were in the UK. I'd be surprised if that doesn't surprise you, but you can check out the figures for yourself. There was also a graduate visa change in 2021, allowing 2 years on a graduate visa before leaving the UK. This would have a net effect because plenty of people who came in 2021 and after would not leave after 3 or 4 years, but instead after 5 or 6 years. So that wouldn't stabilise in the figures from a net migration perspective until 2026 and beyond. I'm a little bit surprised the ONS wouldn't point this out because it's fairly important apart from anything else. Then we've got to consider these 375,000 students as a number as they are. If you have 2 years where 50% of those students that would have left don't leave, and that started in 2021 and 2022 making a difference, 3 years on is 2024, 2025, 2026. So we're right in the mixer of when that would make a difference. That's an extra 187,500 per year based on how many students came to the UK last year. Now perhaps it's relevant for me to share my own experience as a master's student here. I attended a course some years ago with 71 attendees that was 1 year long. 3, including me, were from the UK, 11 more were from mainland Europe, and the remainder were from outside the EU+, as it's known here. The rules at the time had just been changed on visas, which struck me as a bit silly, because these other 57 people had come into the country, paid £30,000 for the course, were spending £10,000 as an absolute minimum if they were subsisting while they were on the course, and the average age was 30, so they had some resources behind them and weren't all necessarily there to behave like undergraduate students. And these people had significant resources, significant family wealth, some of them, apart from anything else. So this struck me as, if you could choose as arbitrarily as this, migrants that any sensible country would absolutely want, but instead many had to leave the UK in short order after the course was finished. On the other side, measures did have to be made to ensure this route wasn't abused. My course was expensive, but many cheaper masters were and are available, and if simply used as a route into the UK with dependents for other reasons, it did also make sense to address that. But I think they got it wrong, and this was a Theresa May Home Secretary thing, and I know many of them at the time expressed the desire to stay in the UK. They were smart, they were erudite, they would have been brilliant employees somewhere, but they couldn't. They didn't then return home and then bother to try and get back into the UK through the visa system. They just stayed back in their countries of origin or went to the States or somewhere that was more accommodating to them. So we lost opportunity there, in my opinion, and that must have been happening at a very big level, certainly at the red brick universities, Russell Group and beyond, if not plenty of other places as well. So as the revisions come in, remember the ONS sometimes go back up to 3 years before we get a final figure. The only movement in the curve of net migration has been upward for the last 3 years, but the revisions in this data have been really significant. One figure that gives perhaps the best sense of the pace of change since the census day in 2021. Provisional estimates for June 2023 indicate a rise of around 1.7 million for the non-EU born population since census day 2021. This is a 26% increase. In contrast, the EU born population in June 2023 has fallen by about 250,000 since census day, which is a decrease of 7%. Now that's a lot in a short space of time, just over 2 years. There's no context given for any precedent or other periods of time before this that were equivalent, maybe in the post-Brexit era, which reshaped the demographics of migration, it seems. Although COVID has also had some kind of incredible impact that you really don't see discussed at length for some reason. So there's not a lot to learn from this other than to take a view on that percentage in isolation. Considering country of nationality, the top 5 non-EU plus nationalities for long-term immigration into the UK in the year ending June 2024 were Indian, 240,000, Nigerian, 120,000, Pakistani, 101,000, Chinese, 78,000, and Zimbabwean, 36,000. So I'm going to leave this as my final points of analysis on this long but rich report. I do think there are multiple reasons to understand these figures and also future predictions. The Indian, remember figures are in only, they're not the net figures, they're the ones I've just read out, but that cohort is roughly split down the middle between work related and study related, so about 120,000 in each camp, right? The Nigerian numbers look very similar in the ratio to the Indian numbers, so that's about 60,000 in each camp, and the Pakistani ones are also very, very similar in about 50,000. There are more counting as other in the Pakistani category for reasons I'm not fully aware of. It doesn't say so in the report. So the Chinese numbers are heavily weighted towards students, although 15,000 count as other. So very few Chinese migrants come into the country for working reasons. They're primarily coming to study, right? And then that's very, very different from the Zimbabwean numbers, because almost all of them come work related. Of that 36,000, 35,000 were work related and 1,000 were study related. Now, I'm sharing these. Now, remember, these are the big five from outside the EU, bear in mind, but the EU numbers are so small, I don't suppose that the EU numbers, any of the EU numbers would make that top five anyway, to be honest. Perhaps somewhere nudges out Zimbabwe, but I doubt it very much. But I share these because, firstly, these are distinctly different from misinformation that's often shared about migration, right? But secondly, looking at the shape of the influx to understand what their future tenants might want or need when it comes to housing, locations, type, etc., these numbers are useful. Lots of Chinese students come won't be a revelation to anyone, I don't think, but Zimbabwean workers might be. Now, there's obviously further research to be done here. And I'm also interested, and this won't surprise anybody either, in the macroeconomic impact of migration. Again, I hear anecdotes or snippets shared on talk radio shows, which I have a bit of a morbid fascination with, to be honest, or on podcasts or online. This leads to looking at forecasts, and the OBR has one, of course, with a very clear message. To get more net benefit from migration must be adults of working age with work visas. They will have a far greater participation rate than the population as a whole when it comes to working. Of course they will. And this is part of the trade-off that it seems a large percentage of people don't want to discuss. If people get older and have a desire to retire and to be paid for that status, aka the state pension, and more people are doing that because of the shape of the population pyramid, the baby boom, etc., then any or all of the following need to apply. Pensions need to stop. Now, that's unthinkable for a number of reasons, so obvious that I don't think I need to list them. Pensions need to kick in later in life, already happening, but likely too slowly. The birth rate needs to move upwards, or mothers need to be incentivised. There's no real sign of any political will for policies like this. And this is being tried, interesting enough, in countries like South Korea, and they're not having a lot of success in their birth rates through the floor in comparison to ours. And then you've got workers, right? They need to be imported and retained in considerable volume. So you need any or all of these policies to make things add up, to balance the books, or to get anywhere near balancing the books. Now, the OBR message seems fairly clear and objective. The desire is for migrants to be coming into the UK with a job already lined up, and I perfectly see no economic justification for being coy about wanting to achieve this. Surely we'd want the best imports in the world, and best in the healthcare or social care sector might look different to the best in the financial services sector. Sure, this seems to be in line with changes made in the Home Office in the past 2 years. The drive towards 90% participation from the OBR forecast versus workers and work dependents from the above figures. Remember, 184k work visas, 233k work dependent visas. As I say, we need to understand visa status versus actual employment rates. Now, the worst presentation of those figures is a participation rate of 44%, which is well below the 63% participation rate of the broader population. Now, the OBR would like to see 90%, which sounds overly hopeful, but it is one, if they could hit that, that would bring considerable economic growth. Now, I don't think you'd find too many official government figures that might suggest migration is a financial burden. I also don't expect there's too many unofficial figures either that stack up because of the leaps of faith that need to be made. It is possible, of course, to do freedom of information requests and things like that. Now, taking my bloodless economist hat off for a moment for a change, macroeconomics and growth are not the only consideration, of course. But please remember they are the ones that I give the most weight to, and they are where my analytical skills sit. So out of interest, Labour have 5 pledges on immigration, in case you're not aware. Number 1, bring down net migration. Now, this reminded me of Sunak's target to half inflation. This will happen, primarily because of the distortion in the student numbers when this graduate visa kicked in 2021. This one's a penalty kick, and the revision upwards in the ONS numbers before Labour were elected only helps this further. Now reduce reliance on overseas workers. As I've said above, unless the birth rate has increased, I can't see it. And how are we defining reliance anyway? This is demographically impossible. You'll have to cook the books to make this one happen, with the number of people that are going to get to the retirement age just over the course of this Parliament. Achieving this but having a huge shortage of, say, healthcare workers would also be a Pyrrhic victory. Number 3, reduce small boat arrivals by cracking down on smuggling networks. It sounds very difficult and unlikely to succeed to me, so I expect this one to fail. Clearing the asylum backlog. This should lower cost and increase growth. The numbers are quite small in the scheme of the entire country, but I think anything with those goals has to be pursued. Of course it does. It's likely to succeed, I think, this one, because again we went from a real changing shape post-pandemic. We had 40,000 in the system backlog in December 2019, and that shot to 134,000 in June 2023, and it still stood at 97,000 in September 2024, the most recent quarterly figures we've got with a 2-month lag. And then increasing returns. The theory is a little sparse in this space. There used to be 40 to 50k returns per year, mostly voluntary, all which cratered during COVID, and is now back to just over 30k returns per year. Again, the cynic in me looking at the trends suggests this is another Sunak inflation pledge. The numbers on this one will just look after themselves. Anyway, you can probably see that I find the subject matter fascinating because it mostly defines the demographic makeup of our future population growth, and also because it dominates so much of the political landscape and has the potential to be a huge consideration in the next election. Currently, 57% of people polled by YouGov say that the economy is the most important issue facing the country. Health is second, mentioned by 46% of people, and then immigration and asylum scores 44%, well above its influence on the economy, which means there are large political considerations at play. Crime, housing, and the environment all come in at 20% for context, which is ridiculous when you think about it. Now, on the 4th of September 2015, those numbers were 71% immigration and asylum, 35% the economy, and 28% health. And yet we didn't see Brexit coming. Go figure. Enough. I know it's been too long this week, but it has been enjoyable to put together. And always I learned something. In fact, I learned quite a lot this week. Hopefully more answers than questions. So as I draw this week to a close, I'll just take the opportunity once again to remind you of the sourcing course I'm going to be delivering on the 21st to the 23rd of March alongside Daniel Kennedy and Nick Bond. It's all sausage, very little sizzle, real examples of how we find deals on a daily and weekly basis, an experience of many tens of thousands of deals analysed to lead to over 1,000 deals being done between us all. There's a reason why we call it Sourcing Solved, because that's what we're aiming to do. Information and tickets at bit.ly/Sourcing Solved 2025. And remember to save that date on the 1st of April for the next Property Business Workshop 2 on due diligence with me alongside Rod Turner. It will be the most comprehensive day on DD to have ever been delivered in the property space, I can guarantee it. Above all, please remember to keep calm, always listen to the supplement and carry on, while all this noise around chancellors, bond yields, TikTok getting banned and goodness knows what else just roars around us. Until next week, folks, thank you.